To the UK now, where a parliamentary committee has ruled that the former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson deliberately lied to members of Parliament about parties and social gatherings held at his office during the COVID-19 lockdown in that country. The Privileges Committee, which examines breaches of parliamentary rules, concluded that Johnson was guilty of repeated contempt of Parliament. The report says the former Prime Minister would have been suspended for 90 days if he had not actually quit the British House of Commons last week. The committee also accused Johnson of being complicit in a campaign of abuse and attempted intimidation. People in London have reacted to the damning findings.
I think he resisted a bit too hard. He probably should have stepped down a bit earlier. So that maybe he kind of clung on to power a bit, kind of reminded me of a good old Trump. But at the end of the day, he was trying to do something, and he obviously believed in it, so I've got to respect that.
I just don't like him at all. I never liked him to begin with, and now I just feel like he just shows time and time again how much of a buffoon he is, and people are still, and then people were moaning so much about Jeremy Corbyn, but he was actually trying to help us, and everyone just let him waste away. It's just ridiculous, and the things that they used to moan at Jeremy for was kind of minimal compared to what Boris does.
Musa Mdunge is a political analyst based at the University of Dundee in the UK. Musa, good evening to you. So Boris Johnson lied. Is anyone surprised?
No, it's no surprise, Stephen. Thank you so much for having me. I mean, the history of this man is that he has been a maverick until the end. He has been a man who believes in bending the rules. We know that his period as Prime Minister was a tumultuous period, one which had many highs, the conclusion of Brexit for one. Secondly, though he had a very slow and controversial start in his handling of COVID-19, he did get ahead of, the preparation for vaccines and the delivery of vaccines in the United Kingdom that saw it do much better in its handling of COVID-19, but also the economic aftermath of COVID-19. And so today he finds himself as the political maverick who is essentially out of the Conservative Party nexus of power. And this is the tragedy of the man who would be king.
There's so many ways to look at this, because you could look at some of the scandals we see in our country and say, well, all he did was have a party during lockdown. So what? So did so many of us. But this was also a person who was making the rules and then breaking the rules. There's a really important sort of political point to this.
Indeed. I mean, fundamentally, what sits at the heart of even this report is the fact that the Prime Minister, as the head of government, the Prime Minister as the leader of the ruling party, must ensure that he keeps confidence not only with the British people, but with Parliament. And so a damning report such as this, that indeed it states that the Prime Minister, in his position as Prime Minister, failed and indeed misled deliberately the House of Parliament, is quite a huge, sanction for the Prime Minister. And it sits at the heart of British politics, is that, politicians will politic, but what must never be in doubt is the words and the truth and the sanctity of the words of a Prime Minister and a leader of society such as Boris Johnson. And so this sits at the heart of it. And this is why this is so important, because next year, United Kingdom will likely go to general elections, and the British people will have their turn in deciding where the country moves in the backdrop of Brexit that has had quite a huge fundamental and consequential, consequences for the United Kingdom's economy. We know that it is being dubbed again the sick man of Europe because it can't seem to fight inflation and economic growth remains low. And of course, the question of immigration still looms large, and Boris Johnson joins that queue of conservative leaders who have failed to deal with this issue.
He resigned as a member of the British Parliament. He must have known these findings were coming. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but is there something a bit cowardly in that?
Well, one may argue that there is something cowardly, but I think for Boris Johnson, he looked at it as the last stand. He looked at it as a way of positioning himself as the person who is simply a victim, a martyr for conservative values. And so that is why, the reason why the sanctioning of that would have been proposed had he remained as MP, of being suspended for 90 days, was seen in part as a reaction to the kind of abuse he, as well as his supporters, spewed towards the committee, declaring it as a kangaroo court. So essentially he tried, by resigning, to pull a Donald Trump. And unfortunately, what he has received in light of that is a reaction that is likely to see the end of his career, or possible resurrection of his career as a Conservative MP and indeed a Prime Minister. And it may well mean that Boris Johnson will have to look outside in order to resuscitate any kind of a political career moving forward.
In a way, he symbolized, he was one of the great symbols of populism around the world himself. Jair Bolsonaro, the US President Donald Trump. We don't quite know what's going to happen in the American election next year. If you do, I'd like to know, Musa. But in a way, the way that Boris Johnson's career has ended, is that a sort of rebuke or a symbolic end of populism in the UK?
Well, it's not necessarily an end of populism, but it is the fact that the populism that the United Kingdom experienced had no fundamental answers or a vision of what the United Kingdom will look like. So when you look at populists such as Adolf Hitler, when you look at even Joseph Stalin to some extent, though he was perhaps more known for his brutality, what you do get a sense of in former forms and shapes and waves of populism in Europe is that they did answer the fundamental question of what the country must look like and how to get there. And unfortunately, because Boris Johnson was too fixated on his own image, his own sense of grandeur, his own sense of immortality, and the fact that it is him who delivered Brexit to the United Kingdom, he forgot to do the hard work. And the hard work lies in laying, number one, a vision, two, in convincing people towards that vision, and in three, building a team that not only shares that vision, but has the expertise and the resolve to then meet out the plan to achieve that vision. To this day, we don't have a sense of what it means for the Conservative Party to govern currently. What is its vision? What is its core values? How will it approach the 2024 election? How will it, implement the policies? Rishi Sunak has failed to implement much of the policies he has promised to do, and this is likely to see the Conservative Party be punished come 2024. And so, indeed, it may not necessarily be an end of populism, but it is indeed an indictment on the failure of this type and generation of populist leaders who have failed to answer the question around vision and the implementation towards achieving that vision.
Musa Mdunge, thank you very much indeed. Political analyst based at the University of Dundee.